Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. Today I have with me Aadit and Mohal to discuss the 1965 war. It's been 58 years and very little is known about this event in history. So Adit, of course, is co-founder of MyIndMakers, a platform that for over 10 years has enabled debate and discussion on various matters related to global and current affairs. Welcome, Adit. Good to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roshan. Great to be here. Slight correction, we are approaching 10 years. We are not at the 10 years mark, but aapke muh mein ghee shakkar.
Well, wish you all the best for another 10 and a 10 after that for sure, right? So,
Thank you. Thank you so
yeah.
much.
So we have Mohal as well. Mohal is the host of the India Rising podcast. Obviously, he's appeared earlier on Bharat Varta as well. He curates conversations on strategic affairs on the podcast. He's also a columnist and has interests in geopolitics and macroeconomics. And this podcast is Mohal's brainchild, in fact. So thank you, Mohal, for mooting this idea and welcome back.
Thanks, Roshan. Always pleasure to be here.
All right, so we have a lot of ground to cover. Indeed, when I said in the intro, right, I mean that very little is known of this war. I had to look at the wiki to see a lot of these punches and counter punches and whatnot. So it went on during a whole, 2 month, 3 month kind of a period, right, and sometime before that. So I guess the right place for us to start will be the circumstances leading to the war. 65 again. If I were to paint the picture, Prime Minister Nehru has just passed, right, and we've had a terrible loss in 1962 with China, right, and the nation is kind of recovering from those two double blows in some sense, right, and Lal Bahadur Shastri is the Prime Minister. Adit, why don't you extend that? What were the circumstances leading up to the 1965 war?
So it was on the Indian side, it was a time for flux, because if people remember the times that preceded the Lal Bahadur Shastri thing, there was a lot of discussions within the Congress party on who would succeed Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru. Mr. Morarji Desai was obviously one of the choices. You had Lal Bahadur Shastri. You had the whole Kamraj camp as well. So, and Indira Gandhi was essentially not what she was. Obviously, she became the prime minister a couple of years later. It was under those circumstances, and you had Mr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan as the president at that time of India. And it was also a time where India had just lost the 1962 China war. So not only was there a political sort of instability, there was also a strategic sort of calculation that India was militarily not that strong as probably it would be in 1971. And then we also had some vestiges left over from the British Indian Army as well. I mean, we'd only been independent for 18 years. We talk about this war having taken place 58 years ago, but we were not independent. India was still, or let's put it this way, at that time independent India was a teenager, only 18 years old. So that those were issues. And another third context which does not get ever talked about when it comes to India Pakistan, this happened at the height of the Cold War. India was seen to be leaning towards British, and Pakistan was seen be leaning towards America, like helped by them. And nowhere was it more clearer when if you compare the fleet of the Air Force. Pakistani Air Force, had a lot of American planes. So given those contexts, the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 was probably one of the most controversial wars, if you may say, because the legacy of the war is disputed. Even in India, we don't know the full picture of it, and neither in Pakistan, because there were advances that were made. Pakistan came very close, like in Gujarat, you had the whole Sir Creek issue, so to speak, and then India comes to striking distance of the Lahore International Airport. There is obviously Kashmir, and like we were discussing before the podcast, you had a Gujarat chief minister assassinated in the last days of the war, and most Gujaratis don't know about it. So, I mean, there are so many complicated contradictions, and I hope we can only try to unpack all of them
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
next.
I mean, it's super interesting. So, Mohal, where I come from, the startup world, we have this concept of a minimum viable product, right? I mean, so you test your hypothesis first, you get feedback from the market, and then, you do a proper launch. The 1965 war had something similar, right? So, there was an incursion of the run of Kutch by Pakistan first in April or thereabouts, just to, gauge perhaps our military preparedness and so on. And could you talk about that? I mean, what was that like? What was the strategy behind that?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll link little bit of what Adit said and what your question was. So I think in the 62 war, like it was a debacle of all sorts. So like India started rearming on a massive scale. I mean, the new administration, there was mass recruitments in the army, and by some reports, it was like 50 to 100%, like a larger army they wanted. Now, Pakistanis realized that by the time 66 arrived, India would have armed herself to a considerable amount. So they wanted to strike when sort of the proverbial iron was hot. I mean, Nehru had passed away. So they sort of like Lal Bahadur Shastri was a weak man and he wouldn't fight back. And also, like in 65, we had like issues like famine, strike India. And also, they thought like before India would regain her military strength, this was the time to strike a hard blow at India. So I mean, and then also one more point, like Pakistan was a member of CETO and CENTO, so they had procured a lot of American military hardware. I mean, supposedly it was against like the communist threat from the north, but obviously we all know like where the Pakistan military hardware gets deployed. So they had acquired the latest Patton tanks and the latest American doctrine. So they wanted to test India out in a place of their own choosing. So the place they chose was in the Rann of Kutch. Now, the Rann of Kutch is basically like kind of a swampy marshland in the area where they tried to do an incursion. So, I mean, now this is like kind of shades of like 1962. So in 1965 January, I mean, see, at that time we didn't have border security force or BSF as we call it. Basically, the Gujarat Reserve Police found that they had made a road passing through what we claimed as Indian territory. I mean, shades of like Aksai Chin in the 1950s. So Pakistan occupied like a place called Kanjar Court inside, just inside our claim lines. At that time, like Pakistan, like we only had an infantry brigade place there, and like Pakistan had mobilized his eighth division, which was like a 3-1 mismatch. They claim that I mean, according to the law of the sea, basically, like you know, the border should run between like the middle of the ocean, but like they considered the marshland to be like a water body, which was not true. So we did protest, and finally in like I believe it was like April 9th April, like Operation Desert Hawk, as they say, they begins. I mean, initially the attack didn't go well. I mean, the Indians did fight bravely, but they fell back to more inland positions. India did beef up its position. It rushed the 50 Para Brigade to Kutch. Then Pakistan brought in more armored regiments. So since the first time they didn't get a lot of success, they did an Operation Desert Hawk 2, where they captured like BR Bet and Point 84. And by the time I think like like both sides, like large scale mobilization, all leaves were cancelled and specter of all out war loomed on the horizon. India informed like US that Patton and Shafi tanks were being used versus India versus like a communist threat. And I think what ended up happening was since the situation got quite serious, I mean, British, as Adi said, we were just 18 years independent, so they still had a lot of interest in the Indian subcontinent. So he wrote to both Prime Minister Shastri and Prime Minister Ayub, and he offered to mediate. And eventually like a ceasefire was declared on 1st May, and then negotiation I think went on till end of June, where we returned. I mean, we also had captured some territory as a response in like Kashmir, like 0.13620 and Black Rocks, and like they had captured in territory in the Kutch, and we both had to return those territories back to each other.
So the next key milestone is Operation Gibraltar, right? This was the formal attack in August of 1965, and this starts in a different place. It starts in Kashmir, and here we see a template that has since been followed afterwards, right? Which is infiltration by plainclothes Pakistani army men, and then the battle ensues going further, right? So Adit, could you talk about Operation Gibraltar? What did they learn from the Run of Kutch invasion? How did Operation Gibraltar start the whole thing?
So, and I'm gonna have, I took some notes and stuff, because so I'm gonna be looking up and down, because there's a lot of statistics involved in Operation Gibraltar, so I don't want to get them wrong. So it started in August 1965, and like you said, that it happened in Kashmir. And basically, this was the first bona fide, correct me if I'm wrong, Mohal, but this was the first bona fide Indian victory apart from what happened in Lahore, where, not only did we successfully push back, we also actually claimed back a lot of the land. And couple of things was the Pakistani infiltrators basically dressed up as Kashmiri locals and infiltrated the Kashmir Valley. And the locals, the Kashmiri population alerted the Indian forces. So that's when they pushed back. So this was like literally is as bad as a film idea where you have thousands of troops essentially dressed up in ferns and basically local uniforms and trying to basically rile up the passions in Kashmir. Now the planning for this, they say that it was conceived almost like a decade or a few years in advance. Of course, Pakistan and their general saabs, they will always come up with their own theories after they've won or lost.
And
So
Bhutto,
many,
and don't forget
and
Bhutto.
and Bhutto. So many generals have said
Bhutto
that
was
this
the
was,
foreign minister, right, at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Okay.
So many
Zulfikar.
people have said that 1950s में हुआ था and stuff, and they tried with different forces. So there was Salahuddin, Ghaznavi, Tariq, Babar, Qasim, Khalid, Nusrat, Sikandar, and Khilji. All of these forces. And which areas are we talking about? Srinagar Valley, Mendhar Rajouri, Kargil Dras, Naushera Sundarbani, Bandipura, Kazinag, Titwal, Guraris, and Minimarg. Another thing that doesn't get talked about is they also targeted parts of Jammu. It's not just Kashmir. And this is again, we are talking about the pre National Highway 1 connecting Srinagar to Leh. So, what impact would have that done to Ladakh? God only knows had they been successful. So it was a very controversial thing. August 1965 is the official date. A lot of people say it could have happened late July. And basically, what they call the Pakistani troops, what they call the Azad Kashmir. Now, here is where the controversial takes start, right? According to India, about 30,000 of them showed up. According to Pakistanis, only 7,000 showed up. And the delta is so huge that, I mean, how do you account for 28,000 men? But if I were to assume, I think the number would be closer to the Indian, like our claim, because if you had so many divisions and so many armored, like such planning going on, it couldn't be just done with 7,000 men. It had to be more. So with that, you had, there was a lot of guerrilla warfare that was planned, that they were going to actually destroy bridges, connections, hospitals, lots of civilized, civilizational damage, like basically jahan cities set up kiya, all those things. So when that happens, an Indian army then realizes, but a lot of people, post-war discussion is the Indian army did not take the warning signs early enough. There's a lot of takes are that they were warned about an impending possibility of that, and we could have been a little better prepared. But ultimately, India did win this part of the war quite decisively.
Right. And I think the general was General Harbaksh Singh, right?
Yeah, the Western Army Command. But so I wanted to give like couple of like so like why did they do this? So one was, it was they wanted an general uprising, and I think it was also the 1 year anniversary in middle of August when Sheikh Abdullah was arrested. So they wanted to leverage that fact, and also just the previous December, the holy relic of the Prophet, his hair was in the Hazrat Bal Shrine. So it was stolen, and there was a lot of upheaval during that time after, and it was returned eventually. But Pakistan wanted to work on this chaos, that people are upset and they just need to be instigated, and they will pick up their arms and they will do all revolt. And the plan was to eventually capture Srinagar and like capture the radio station, the TV station, and declare like, okay, they have an independent Kashmir being declared live on TV.
Right.
But their plans, like what happened, like very early into the op Gibraltar, like a young shepherd called Muhammad Din, he was paid rupees 400 by the infiltrators to keep quiet, and like they were asking for like directions, and but like he got suspicious, and like he informed the local police. There's another shepherd also, I think, and they informed, and I think the army started the operations maybe like couple of days after the infiltration. And I think they started rounding up, and all the escape routes were closed down. And I think one of the other things that Adit was mentioning, that we did capture territory, was the famous capture of Haji Pir Pass. So if you look at on the map of Haji Pir, I think it's like a big bulge which protrudes into the Indian sector. I think that's where all the infiltration, especially into the valley, even as of today, like it's a peak because like a Uri and Punch, like, where the infiltration used to take place. So what Indian army had decided that we would lead a mission to like capture Haji Pir. I mean, it was just to stop the infiltration, and also like once the Indian army got to its act together, I mean, a lot of the infiltrators were escaping back to Pakistan. So they wanted to not only stop the inflows but also stop the outflow and just capture or round up as many of them as possible. So like Brigadier Zorawar Bakshi, like, I mean, he was a highly decorated officer of World War II. He led the operation. And like Zorawar Bakshi, I mean, asked one para Major Ranjit Singh Dayal to lead a commando style operation to Haji Pir, and I think both of them won a Mahavir Chakra for their operation. And I think eventually I mean, they outflanked the Pakistani defenders by climbing western steep wall. And on 20th August, they had captured Haji Pir Pass.
Now, one thing, Roshan, before we get into this, is a lot of people forget why was it called Operation Gibraltar, right?
Yeah, the
Because
names
the
are
Pakistani,
the
yeah,
names are
and because
extraordinary,
Bruce,
right? I mean, through the entire period itself, right? You have
exactly.
Gibraltar, Grand
So,
Slam,
so
Nepal, and so on. So
Bruce,
yeah,
yeah, so Bruce Riddle writes in his book that, and there are multiple other sources, that the Pakistan leadership was choosing this name because they wanted to draw a parallel to the Muslim conquest of Portugal and Spain that was launched in 780. So, ye jo abhi jo pagalpan they had, trying to equate ourselves to, or themselves, I mean, to Islamic world and so forth, that was going on 50 years ago also. There was no great liberal movement going on in Pakistan even at that time, or something that changed post Ziaul Haq. And one interesting thing I will tell you is that they named this after Gibraltar. Guess who controls Gibraltar right now, or who did for the last 200 years? A country called United Kingdom. So they took all these inspirations and stuff, but the same country that was ruling over India and Pakistan, or undivided India at that time, was also the country doing that. And I honestly don't know if the Pakistani generals knew it when they were making these claims or names or something. So the irony is just unbelievable.
well, history is very subjective, at least when it comes to Pakistan, right? I mean, they have their own
If
theories
you call
about
it history or their version, like you
other
actually
version.
on, and I would urge people to read articles or even go to the Wikipedia page and see this wonderful little table that I saw 2 days ago when I was researching for the podcast, which says Pakistani claims, and they are absolutely hilarious. Like one of the claims is they shot down 100 and something IAF aircrafts and that. And I was like, if you have shot down more than 150, no way the Indian Air Force would be so ready to, go in 1971 and do the damage that it did. So it is,
I mean,
the
in
claims are
Pakistan,
so
like
funny.
I mean, all the wars are declared as victories, though they didn't win any of the wars. And like, I mean, we'll come to like September 6th is declared as Lahore Defense Day, So
I
No,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Roshan,
this
but
was
I
a
had to
no, no.
give
This was
this.
a fun tangent for sure, and I'm sure that there will be many other fun tangents for us to go down, right? Because this is it is one such period like that, right? So, but to summarize, Operation Gibraltar was launched in Kashmir, and the Indian forces, although may have not been as well prepared, have knocked them back, right? I mean, now this is the status at this point, but the Pakistanis don't stop. They double down with Operation Grand Slam, right? And they march towards Aknur. So what happens now, Mohal?
yeah, so I think they didn't foresee, like they thought like Operation Gibraltar would be like a pretty well success, and Operation Grand Slam would be the mopping up operation where they could take over Kashmir once it has been liberated by the freedom fighters, and there is an uprising in the Kashmir Valley. So eventually they found out that the Ob Gibraltar, I mean, and they didn't never expected Indians to capture the Haji Pir Pass, and even the 0.13620 and Black Rocks that were given away, the ceasefire, they were again recaptured, and Pakistan were again found wanting to not be able to defend this. So eventually they had to take the initiative back because they were losing the initiative once the Ob Gibraltar fizzled out. Eventually they targeted an area called Aknur in the Chamjoria region. So basically, I mean, they had a better lay of the land approaching this India. It was just lightly defended. It was like not easy to reach. I mean, it was a 191 brigade versus was just lightly defended. So on 1st September they launched Operation Grand Slam with a whole division, and this was by Akhtar Hussain Malik. He launches it, and this was supposedly a brainchild of Yahya Khan. I mean, even Musa Khan, the Pakistan chief of army staff, has later reported to us said that he was opposed to this operation. But anyways, like Bhutto had egged on Ayub Khan. I mean, even Ayub Khan had famously said that the Hindu morale would not stand up to like the fight of the Pakistani, and a couple of hard blows, and basically they will like wither away. It's kind of. I mean, sorry, I'm paraphrasing it very badly here. I mean, maybe Adit might know the phrase better, but so this was like supposedly the hammer that would have supposed, or the straw that would have broken the camel's back. So the whole operation was to make an ingress into India and capture the Aknur bridge. So what they would have done is, once they got the Aknur bridge over, I believe the Chenab, they would have cut off like places like Rajouri, Naushera, which were like kind of north of there, and would have done significant damage to India, because that was the only lifeline going up there. So they attacked with like Akhtar Hussain Malik. He attacked with the whole 12th division of the Pakistan army, and this was when they deployed their famed Patton tanks, and their I think even they had the Shafis or something. In India, just had a brigade now. The
Hey,
20 Lancers.
can we
Yeah,
take a slight tangent and discuss the kind of weaponry involved on both sides? I mean, you mentioned
yeah.
the Patton tanks. What other things are happening on both sides?
Yeah, so Pakistan had been like gotten the American military hardware at this point, and they had, I believe, like 7 or 9 regiments of the latest Patton tanks. They were like supposedly the best in the world at that point, and Indians were still using like some of the older tanks of the pre-World War vintage, and also they had the Centurions, which were like post-World War II, but they were not superior to them. So that was, and then we are also using the light AMX tanks made by the French, which was also no match for the Patterns, given equality in man, but like the Indian training proved to be superior in this war. And Op Grand Slam rolled on. I mean, the Indian like 20 Lancers C Squadron Major Bhaskar Roy, with just like light Patton tanks, he fought very bravely against the Pak armor, and he held up, and he was awarded the Mahavir Chakra. So by the end of 1st September, things look dire, and a 191 brigade is kind of has fallen back, is kind of decimated. So the Chief of Army Staff J.N. Chaudhary asked for IF support, and the Defense Minister Y.V. Chavan okays it. I mean, Arjan Singh, the Chief of Air Staff, had warned that we could mistakenly hit Indian position, because they had no idea. I mean, they were just given a map and said like go hit, and they said like Pakistan had run over. So I think they did accidentally hit 3 Indian tanks, and they disabled Indian tanks and an ammunition depot, but they did hit some of the patterns, and they did damage tanks. I mean, and by the first day, I mean, we had inflicted some, at least destroyed over 20 tanks with aircraft and the 20 Lancers. But I mean, we had practically given up chum at that time. Now on 2nd September, I mean, they left a pretty battered 191 brigade between Akhnur and Chum, which Pakistan could easily roll on. Now, this is where it gets very controversial. So at that point, on around, I think, just before noon, Pakistan Chief of Army Staff Musa Khan replaces Akhtar Hussain Malik with Yahya Khan. Now there have been a lot of conspiracies like, okay, was he sidelined because Yahya Khan was a friend of Ayub? But then again, Musa was no friend, was not on the best of relations with Ayub Khan. Was he replaced because an Ahmadiyya? I mean, but then Ayub Khan was pretty like secular in his leaning, so nobody knows. Or maybe the Indian Air Force, like, and the stiff defense put up, did they want to replace the generals? But that 24-hour gap is the sort of the turning point in the
Hang on, hang
uh
on, hang on.
yeah,
So
yeah.
this part, right? I mean, it always gets me. You have someone who has led from the front and he is apparently succeeding. Why replace the leader of the command at that critical juncture
Yeah,
of the war?
I mean, even the Pakistani sources, they're different. Like some say because he was Ahmadiyya, some say that Yahya Khan was more closer to Ayub, and he wanted the title of the liberator of Kashmir, because he wanted his favorite general to liberate Kashmir. Sources close to Musa Khan says that it hadn't gone well, and they wanted somebody better. So I mean, yeah, it's like very controversial. Everybody has his own theory.
So
Unfortunately, there's
at this
no.
point of time, it's safe to assume they thought it was an eventuality, right? I mean that they're going to
Could be. Yeah,
They're
yeah,
going to lay claim
yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Probably they were going to be in Aknur by like, I mean, they had planned to be on that first day, but like maybe on the second day, if they had rolled over, because see, India were rushing in forces, like we had rushed in the 41st Mountain Brigade, the 20th Infantry Brigade, which, but like they were still like some time away. So eventually they replaced, and this 24 hours is very crucial. So India rush in forces, some from even I think a Pathankot, some tanks from Pathankot. So we fight a retreating battle, but we slow down their advance, and finally Joria falls on 5th September. But and then like they are very close to Aknur, and then I guess the events of Operation Riddle happen, which I think we can discuss then what happens next.
Adit, over to you. What happens with Operation Riddle and then thereafter Operation Nepal?
So, before we get into the Operation Riddle part of it, like we talked about the tangents, I want to take one slight tangent here and talk about, because you guys were talking about the tanks, right? The official claims are that Pakistan lost at least in excess of 200, close to 300 tanks, and India lost tanks too, but not as many. So India probably lost 100 in spite of having, so to say, inferior tanks than Pakistan did. And if you notice, the lot of the 65 stories of the majors and generals or the subedars of the Indian army were known as tank destroyers or stuff. So that was a big thing. The only place where India suffered was a little bit of the performance of the Indian Air Force, because we were outnumbered, where we lost close to 50, 60 aircraft. And I mean, yes, Pakistanis also lost 20 plus aircrafts, but the fact is, on the Air Force, Pakistan won the war. But the third and most important discussion that doesn't happen is, we gained territory, right? So how much territory did we gain, and how much territory did we lose? The estimates are India probably lost 5 to 600 square kilometers of territory, but we gained about 1700 square kilometers of Pakistani territory, maybe even close to 1800. So there is no way that when the war was declared and there was a ceasefire ended and there was a ceasefire, India actually ended up giving up a little more of that. And then we'll talk about the geopolitical implications and, post Shastri and Tashkent and all that, what happened in the later part. But I just wanted to take a tangent, at that point of time, even when it came to territorial disputes, distances, India had a far greater sort of hold on Pakistan than the other way around.
Also, I mean, at this point, I think we also have to state the fact that this is the largest tank battle since the Second World War, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
Chavinda.
and
Yeah.
less than 2 decades after the Second World War.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
or 2 decades
And then
after.
also on the Indian Air Force losses, I think a lot of the losses were on ground, not in the air. And then in Indian destruction
Yeah,
of
not in the
Pakistani
air,
aircraft
correct.
was in the air. Like, so Indian, like kind of like, I mean, it's like superior, like shooting down an aircraft parked on the ground versus in the air. So like Indians probably shot down a lot of the Pakistani aircraft and hardly anything on the ground, while the Pakistanis majority of their hits were aircraft on the ground. And I think it says to like some of the disconnect between the Indian Air Force and the army, the senior army leadership, especially General Chaudhary, who didn't like apprise Indian Air Force many times of what was going on.
Here is the thing. Operation Riddle talks about, the discussion, the attacks on like West Pakistan, the Came Current sector, and so forth. What we forget totally, completely, was what happened with the Air Force, or what happened in this. You had, it was a premonition, or it was a prelude to what was coming in 1971, and the Indian Air Force understood and struck back. And Indian Air Force in 1971, I mean, completely dominated the war. Now back to Operation Riddle. This is a question for you guys, a lot of others. How many of us know about, Quartermaster Havaldar Abdul Hamid? Everyone knows about it. Everyone has heard the story about, the four grenadiers, and, with his gun, and he was basically, knocking out tanks and so forth. But that happened in Operation Riddle, right? And I have to say, when the Indian Army actually posted about this 3 or 4 years ago in September, because September being the anniversary of the 1965 war, and how he got the Paramveer Chakra, so many people commented saying, "Oh, we had no idea about it. We had no idea about it." So basically, when the Pakistani with the Patton tanks that Mohal was talking about launches an attack in the Kemkaran sector.
No. So to relieve the pressure in, okay, so like what happens is like, sorry to take over, like the
Yeah, no,
once
go for it.
uh,
Go for it.
once Aknur is about to fall, India is under tremendous pressure, because Aknur falls, like it brings that link to Nowshera and Rajouri. So what ended up happening, like even when Operation Desert Hawk happened in the April timeframe, Indian Army comes up with this plan that what shall we do to give a response to Pakistan. So they had come up with Operation Riddle, that we will go across the border and will threaten Lahore to relieve the pressure. And I think probably by second or third, I don't remember the date, September, I think
6th
YB Chavan and
September.
no, but that's when the operation starts. But like they had been given
Correct,
like
correct.
a 48-hour notice. So the plan was that they will. Okay, this was kind of interesting. So Harbakh Singh, he made the plan that basically we won't, like usually you move up to your forward position and then you go to war. But then he said he wanted a rolling start, that you just start rolling and you don't stop in your forward meetup position and you just go. So around 2nd or 3rd September, YV Chavan and Lal Bahadur Shastri, and this is to the credit of Shastri, that he says, okay, we will open a new front across the international border, will threaten Lahore to ease the pressure in Chamjoria. And that's how
Shamjha.
Operation
But
Riddle starts.
correct, but then there is another part which is very interesting. So not only do they attack Lahore, you're right. I got the dates mixed up there. But not only do they attack Lahore, 2 days later, the Indian Army decides that we are going to also attack Sialkot. So on September 8th, September 6th, we are doing the Lahore. September 8th, we are doing Sialkot. By the time September 10 comes and the whole Abdul Hamid and the Pakistani offensive in the Khemkaran sector happens, we've already captured many hundred square kilometers of area around the Lahore Sialkot region. And what is interesting then is, that day, by the way, as Mohal said, it was observed as the Lahore Defense Day, so to speak. Defense Day, and they do it with a parade outside the big Minar Sharif and Allama Iqbal's grave Mausoleum. What is interesting is this is probably in 1999. This decision was not taken to cross the LOC. Of course, the context was very different and everything. But in 1965, the conscious decision was taken by a so called weak Prime Minister in Lal Bahadur Shastri, according to Pakistan. And that is what makes this decision even more interesting. Yeah, because between the Nehruvian, I think that was the first time India broke away from the Nehruvian consensus. Because in 1962 we were just so shocked that, oh, China ऐसा कर कैसे सकता है, after we did the principle of Panchsheel and said that our big brother should go to the UN instead of us, right? There was no longer that, oh, we can't do it, boss. If you've come into India, we're going to come into your country. And Indian government is not going to officially say this on the record, but there was a clear understanding that if we want to get back the area that the Pakistanis have taken, we have to capture some of them, and then there has to be a trade-off. And I think this was the first, Operation Riddle was the first acknowledgement that that strategy was going to be pursued at a larger scale.
Right. And 71 we hit at Karachi, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
70, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
But we didn't take over the territory. But yeah, that was to hit at them.
we
I
could
mean,
have.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, so like I think what Adit alluded was is important. So the 11 Corps was supposed to threaten the Lahore area. So like there is a canal just east of Lahore called the Ichogil Canal. So see, like in the Punjab territory, like all these water obstacles are formidable obstacles for a whole army or a division to cross over. So the whole idea was move the border or the front line from the international border all the way up to the Ichogil Canal, which is the canal just outside. So we were not going to capture Lahore. I mean, a city of millions, it's very hard to control population. So we wanted to push the boundary, the front line towards the eastern bank of the Ichogil Canal. And similarly in Sialkot, because Sialkot is just south of Chamjoria, we wanted to relieve the pressure. So we wanted to move it to the MRL Canal. But so the original plan was that the 11 Corps in Lahore and 1 Corps Sialkot, they were supposed to attack at the same day. But because 1 Corps was a very new race division, they took time, and that was so the element of surprise was lost kind of for the 1 Corps, and they could not attack at the same time, and which probably caused like the little bit of element of surprise. And eventually like we did on the first day, like the 3 Jats, they even crossed the Ichogil Canal. And this is a kind of interesting side note. They went to a place called Batapur, which was like a Bata factory. And some of the soldiers also claim that we tried on few Bata shoes in there, so there was one unit which went to the western side of the Ichogil Canal, but this was, I think, the maximum we progressed. But after that, it was kind of like the other units didn't progress well. And eventually like then the Pakistan Air Force that Adit alludes to, so they strafed the Indian positions very hard. and Major General like Niranjan Prasad, he wanted to withdraw, and there was a lot of disagreements with Harbaksh Singh and JN Chaudhary, and he was sacked. So he was one of the most senior generals to be sacked in middle of a war. I mean, he also had not served well during in Nefa or Arunachal Pradesh in the 1962 war, and this is like kind of controversial that he was let go in middle of a war, you know.
Interesting. So both sides had generals being replaced, right? There are plenty of regiments and so on that were involved, right? But can we talk about a few of these folks, like perhaps the role of the 4th Grenadiers? You mentioned 3rd Jat. There's also 9th Deccan, 1st Armored Division, and so on. And, what were some of these regiments on the Pakistani side that, were key players and integral parts of the war?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, we talked about Quartermaster Abdul Hamid, and actually, so it was. It's, I mean, now called the Grenadiers. At that time, it was known as the 4th Bombay Grenadiers, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, now I don't know how, what what we are allowed to say, if it's 4th Mumbai Grenadiers or 4th Grenadiers or something. but the fact is but the fact is, this was an old tested force, not from the 1700 or the 1800s, where they had fought in Punjab, Central India, Afghanistan, Burma. I mean, you just have to look at their World War I and II, in the Kohima, the capture in the Naga village. So it was all sorts of amazing sort of history. And then post-war, obviously, the Tololing and the Tiger Hill, we know that I had what they did. But we are not going to go into 1999, because we are all guilty about having a recency bias. And but let's talk about the Battle of Asaruttar, because that's their crowning glory, where what Harbaksh Singh, what Mohal talked about, Lieutenant General Harbaksh Singh, J.S. Dillon, Thomas K. Theograj, and we had a bunch of units. And the 4th Grenadiers say that they had destroyed around close to 100 Pakistani tanks there.
Wow.
And that is the most, I mean,
It's
incredible.
crazy.
And then
It was,
the place where it is, I'm sorry to interrupt, it's called
yes.
Patan Nagar today because there's so many abandoned and destroyed Patan tanks in that area. So I don't know how many Indians know that there is a city in Punjab called Patan Nagar because for the Patan tanks.
That is such a Punjabi thing to name Patan Nagar. so, but I mean, I want people to understand and let this sink in. India lost 24 tanks compared to their 100. So for every 4 Pakistani tanks, you essentially just lost 1 tank. So you were beating them 4-1. And that was such an important point from 8th to 10th September, what we did. And all this happened, by the way, in 2 or 3 days. That's how brutal and swift the offensive was. So basically, in spite of Pakistanis actually initially going in and stuff, the Indian army pushed back. But what I had read while doing this research from this, and again, this could be disputed and stuff, but what I had read is there was a gentleman as a lieutenant of artillery in the 16 SP Field Regiment from Pakistan. His name was Parvez Musharraf, and he saw Parvez Musharraf actually saw the bravery of Abdul Hamid, who was honored with the Paramveer Chakra, India's highest military award, for allegedly knocking out 7 tanks with 1 recoil gun. Inside, truly insane. So I mean, that's the insanity, or that's the brutality of the Indian offensive. So I don't think this is talked about. We talk about ये India का हमेशा problem है. We talk about individual heroes, right? We talk about Abdul Hamid. We'll talk about Vijayan Thapar. We talk about all these people, and we should talk about them. But apart from them, we should also talk about the whole unit along with that, what happens, because it's never one person. Any army officer will tell you. So yes, talk about the heroes, but also talk about the units. So that's my. And he was only 32, by the way, when he died.
So let me elaborate more on the Khemkaran. So I think as Adit rightly said, like many times the unit, like in this case, the 4th Mountain Division, of which this was a part of. So I think what happened is like once we crossed over to Sialkot and Lahore on 8th and 10th September, I think the Pakistanis were kind of under, sorry, 6th and 8th September, the Pakistanis were kind of under pressure because they had lost a lot of territory, as you had just alluded to. So what they did was their first armored regiment, which was in the Kasur area, which is kind of just opposite Khemkharan, they are like kind of twin towns. They invaded into India. To their whole plan was cut up, go on the backside of the Punjab and cut off and capture possibly the Bias bridge, and even go all the way up to Amritsar. Now, because India had spread out all its forces, and this is, I think, where the dispute occurs with Harbakh Singh and J.N. Chaudhary, that J.N. Chaudhary wanted to attack through Sialkot, while Harbakh Singh said, like, let's keep all our forces in Punjab and attack through the enclaves of Dera Baba Nanak, so that in case some Pakistani attack comes, they can move the forces around. But because they were far in Sialkot, it was very hard. So what ended up happening was that only the 4th Mountain Division was standing guard, and if it had fallen, I mean, even Amritsar could have been possibly threatened. So what ends up happening is that eventually, in the first few days of the Khemkharan offensive, like, some of the units either desert or are destroyed. So out of the 6 battalions, we are down to 3.5. Only, like, the now the very famous 4 grenadiers and one named Gorkha are left. And eventually, like, we had to, I think, Theograj, that Adit had referred to. So the second independent armored brigade, which is kind of the whole reserve for the whole of Punjab, basically there are no reserve units left. They rush into Khemkharan to support it, and they flood the paddy fields. They make it a narrow killing field, and in a concentric circle, they fire upon the Pakistanis and they pick off all the Pakistani tanks. But one controversial thing that happens is, when the Khemkharan offensive is running very badly for India, and it would appear that the 4th Mountain Division, I mean, which also had a bad history because it lost in Tawang, was on the verge of collapse. General Chaudhary, actually, and this is like a said in an interview by Captain Amrinder Singh, who was the 8-day camp ADC to General Harbakh Singh. So he calls up Harbakh and says, like, withdraw behind the Bias on a defensive position. Now this was appeared very bad because we would have practically left Amritsar to the Pakistanis possibly. And this was like shades of 1962, where we had withdrawn from Arunachal or Nepa to the plains of Assam, and we had abandoned. So this would have been a very deep blow to the Indian psyche if we had done that. But Harbakh Singh says, no, you either come here and give me a personal order or give it in writing. And J.N. Chaudhary doesn't do that. And Harbakh Singh stays there. In one day, the situation changes, and they have put up a better resistance. And but this was like crazy that we might have even abandoned if not for the steadfastness of Lieutenant General Harbakh Singh. And even as Adit referred, like, we destroy over 100 tanks, and we fight a great tactical battle, and it's like a graveyard of pattern tanks, and today it is called Patan Nagar.
So at this point, let's say, about a week before the eventual ceasefire, what does it look like, Adit? On balance, do you think the Indian side has the upper hand, or is it still kind of an even contest or a stalemate?
So it's a very complicated situation. I think, by if you ask most experts, clearly the Indian side absolutely has an upper hand when it comes to the things that happened after the Khemkara and in the Jammu and Kashmir region and stuff. But throughout, I think where the Indian side did have the sort of losses, the biggest losses, as we talked about, was the Indian Air Force, where the Pakistani Air Force had smaller losses. And we realized the issues that happened, and we rectified that in the war. I mean, no one expected we would be fighting a war 6 years later with Pakistan, but that's unfortunately that's how it panned out, right? So that's one thing. But I would say the Indian side had the slight upper hand. The reason we say the war ended in a stalemate is because, unfortunately, we have to look at things that happened beyond the war. And when it comes to the peace agreements or Tashkent agreements, and we'll talk about it, the geopolitical considerations and the ramifications, we ended up giving up a lot of stuff that we gave it. But I mean, we were what, a miles throw away from the Lahore International Airport. The Americans had started evacuating their diplomats out of Lahore. So, given that situation, and the whole Sialkot situation that happened, that is a pretty solid indication that the Pakistanis were scared of what was coming.
So not as convincing as the 1971 war, where
Oh
we
no, no,
had
absolutely.
about
This was a
100,000.
proper Yeah, this was a proper stalemate with minor skirmishes and stuff that we won. I mean, not minor, but like major skirmishes and battles. And we talked about the battle of the tanks that India definitely and for sure won. But 71 was a resounding defeat for the Pakistanis on both sides. मतलब actually भिगो भिगो के मारा था पाकिस्तानी आर्मी को 71 में.
Right. So eventually the UN intervenes, right? And we have the Tashkent agreement, and of course, infamous for what happens to Shastri Ji after that, right? But what does the Tashkent agreement entail, Adit?
So the Tashkent agreement was an interesting agreement. First of all, it's important to know of the background of what happened in Tashkent, because we are talking about the undivided USSR. It's a city in Uzbekistan right now. You had situations where the Russian sort of establishment was refusing to take a position in that, and then Alexei Kosygin becomes the mediator, under Lal Bahadur Shastri and Muhammad Ayub Khan. They did a declaration on 10th January 1966, which was basically a framework for lasting peace, saying that they would pull back their pre-conflict positions from their pre-August lines no later than February 25th, 1966. Neither nation would interfere in each other's affairs, internal affairs. Economic and diplomatic relations would be restored, and there would be an orderly transfer of prisoners of war, which both leaders would work towards improving bilateral relations. Now, this was heavily criticized in India because there was no war pact. And there was no renunciation ke Kashmir mein the guerrilla warfare. I mean, we talked about in the podcast previously how people dressed up as Kashmiris and invaded, part of Kashmir and stuff, the whole Operation Gibraltar and stuff. And there was no condemnation within the agreement of doing that. And after that, you have, after the Tashkent agreement, we were talking about it, literally 2 weeks after that, Homi Jahangir Baba dies under very mysterious circumstances in an air crash. And so there are various repercussions and stuff in Pakistan. Apparently there was major pushback as well, because they felt कि पता नहीं क्या हो रहा है. And Muhammad Ayub Khan essentially just went into he became a bit of a recluse. There is another interesting thing that I found out, that a lot of people don't know, that not only was Muhammad Ayub Khan the president of Pakistan, he was also the defense minister of Pakistan, and he had been in office for 8 years. And during the war, or the beginning of the war, for 6 months, he was also the minister of interior. So there was this bizarre situation that for a 6-month period, the same guy was the leader, the interior minister, and the defense minister of the country, and he was making the decisions, every decision for Pakistan. So from there he went to became a recluse. But post that, I think we don't talk about it much, because the unfortunate death of Lal Bahadur Shastri, that kind of overshadowed the agreement that happened or something. But I think the leadership that Lal Bahadur Shastri displayed during the war and post the war, unfortunately, and maybe India did not have the bargaining chips at the table. India was under too much pressure from the Americans and the Soviets. We were not able to negotiate a good deal for ourselves.
Right. What happens to some of these key figures post the war? Mohal, you could talk about the Pakistani side. What happens to Ayub Khan, Yahya Khan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and the others?
Yeah, so Ayub Khan, like once the Tashkent agreement is signed, basically Zulfikar Ali Bhutto declares the declaration to be like a political surrender. I mean, which turned a military victory into defeat. I mean, Pakistan, as you know, are always deluded to think like every war they won and every agreement is like kind of a sellout to the opposing party. So in 1967, eventually, like Bhutto forms his own party, now the Pakistan People's Party. Eventually there are like demonstrations, even like at this time the Awami League under Mujibur Rahman is raising in popularity in the east, where what is known as East Pakistan or Bangladesh. Eventually, like Ayub Khan, he also survives like a assassination attempt, and then basically he tries to do some negotiation while trying to sideline both Mujibur Rahman and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, but like they don't come up with any agreement or solution, because the two main opposition parties are not included. Eventually, like Ayub Khan is reported to have like a cardiac arrest, and due to his health issues, he's like paralyzed, and he eventually hands over power to Yahya Khan in 1969. And eventually, like the events that leads to the events of 1971 war.
Right. So Adit, I think earlier we spoke about the fact that Shastriji had an insane amount of political capital. In fact, I mean he was the one guy who could actually sell as bad an agreement as what it was, the Tashkent agreement, right? I mean he could do that. Now in his absence, there is a political vacuum, and what follows after that is we have Mrs. Indira Gandhi coming to power and so on, right? So what do you think would have happened if Shastriji had lived? Do you think that obviously it's a big hypothetical, but how would India be different?
I think it's hard to say how would India be different or not, because first of all, Indira would never have been come to power this fast or something, because there would still be an internal challenge with the Morarji faction and the Kamraj faction challenging Shastri, but of course with a different sort of fervor. I think India would have taken a different route in terms of engagement with Pakistan. I personally don't think Shastri would have taken the same role that Indira Gandhi took in the whole Bangladesh war, because that was a very different sort of, even with the Mukti Bahini situation and stuff. And India certainly took a very prominent turn towards the Soviet Union under the leadership of Indira Gandhi after that. Now, granted, some of it could be things that we needed, and at that time in the 70s, during the Nixon era and stuff, Pakistan had taken a firm turn towards America as well. You just have to read the books, the Blood Telegram book, and there are many other books about the 1971 war. And you have to understand, America was also going through a very weird time post Shastri. So 1963, John F. Kennedy dies, very popular president. Then Lyndon B. Johnson takes over. In 1966, when all this is happening, America has a mess of its own in Vietnam. And at that time, Lyndon B. Johnson becomes a very unpopular president, because everybody is talking about stopping the war and stuff like that. So even in the Cold War situation, there is a lot of ifs and buts that are happening then. Then comes 1971, when for the first time, unlike 1966, there was no dichotomy. Obviously there was some dichotomy in foreign policy, but Russia actually stands up for India in the United Nations. There is this wonderful video of Sardar Swan Singh and them. They were talking about the 1971 war and how Russia vetoes the decision about the ceasefire, and that's what was so significant in India getting a victory. So I think Shastri may not have gone that thing, but I don't think Shastri was averse to going. But what was different was the socialism tinge that Indira Gandhi took in terms of bank nationalization and stuff. And Lal Bahadur Shastri was a socialist. I think economically he would have not made the same drastic measures. He would have not taken the same drastic measures that Indira Gandhi took. So that would have been the different sort of approach. But he would have certainly ruled for another 5 years, if not another 10, because he was that popular at that point of time. There would have been an election in less than 12 or 16 months, because if you remember, the last election was in 1962, and so 1967 there would have been an election just a year after this, and Shastri would have won. That's why I say very confidently that Shastri would have won very comfortably. But instead, what happens is, in 1967, Congress gets a real scare, because they drop to the lowest, and the Bharatiya Jansangh actually gets 35 plus seats, and a lot of places, basically, non-Congress forces start gaining traction. So that was the difference that Shastri's death made.
Right. Mohal, we say that past often repeats itself, right? And still we're living with the echoes of some of these incidents that have happened earlier. Whether it is the Kashmir infiltration that Adit brought up, or even the fact that some of these agreements are not structured very much in our favor, right? Whether it is the Tashkent agreement or the Shimla agreement, arguably, right? So, what are some of those things that still kind of live with us beyond 65?
As you said, like some of the decisions or what ifs of the war. I mean, one was like General J.N. Chaudhary's advice to Prime Minister. So just before the war closes, the Prime Minister asked him about the general situation of the Indian Army. So in terms of ammunition, at that point, General Chaudhary has reported saying like we are only down to 15% of our ammunition. But apparently it was the exact opposite. Like we had 85% ammunition left. So we could have stretched the war on for much longer. And I think the sort of I mean, we had gained like 3 times the territory that Pakistan had gained, or 2 to 3 times, but we could have like landed a decisive blow on Pakistan if the war had gone on longer. So that is like one of the big what ifs for India, for the Indian perspective. Also, like as General Harbakh Singh writes in his memoirs, war dispatches, not I mean in the his official history of the war, that like some of the leadership on the Indian side, especially like as we see the sacking of Major General Niranjan Prasad, was found lacking. And even the one armored corps, which after initial successes, I mean, they had to stop couple of times for a couple of days, and they had to restart the war for the one corps. So what ended up happening is, as you see, like the Battle of Chavinda, eventually like it comes to like a kind of a stalemate kind of situation. So we could have avoided the 71 war, and we could have like landed the decisive blow in 65. I mean, but like who knows, I mean, we might not be having an independent state of Bangladesh today, if that had happened.
All right. There's certainly a lot of nuances and different facets that we can explore, but we leave the viewers and listeners to kind of go down the rabbit hole on this. But this was a fascinating conversation. I think we're kind of covering things in reverse, right? I mean, we did 99, we did 71, we're now doing 65, and perhaps next we'll take up 62, right? And thank you again, Adit and Mohal, for being on the podcast. As always, an absolute pleasure to talk to you guys. And folks, do check out the episodes we did on the 71 and 99 wars as well. Again, fascinating content on both these episodes. Until next time, see you soon. Take care and Jai Hind.